My first question would really be about, the series of seminars that you both organized together in Paris in the 1980s, and how this came about, the idea of the book, and how did you decide on to use these three core categories as the main starting points for your discussions?
Well, personally, I'm no longer sure how it all came about. We met in 1981 through at a conference that was organized in New Delhi. We became friends. We met each other, and one day we had lunch, and we said, "Why don't we do this kind of seminar?" Mm-hmm. We were only planned 1 year originally, I think. It was the racism and ethnicity.
Absolutely.
And that was a big success in the sense of people came and were interested. So we did a second year and then a third year. That worked very well. It was precisely the beginning, the moment when people were raising questions about what had seemed traditional ideas about class, about race, and so forth. It was a good moment to do this. Mm-hmm. But having done it, the original idea, I suppose, was to have a book as a result of each of these years' seminar, but you know, papers are of unequal quality, and then you can't get people to do it in time. And so it occurred to us, let's forget about the other papers, let's talk about our papers, since we wrote papers for each of that. And basically the book is therefore our discussion between Étienne and me of the intellectual problem that is posed by the relationship of race to nation to class. So I think that's how it came about.
I agree. May I add a few
Please.
Details to that as
Sure,
I remember
fine,
them?
Please.
Okay. We had met in India, and then we meet again in Paris a year after that or so, having lunch, as you said. I even remember where it was. And we start exchanging ideas and feelings about the situation in which we were. So that was in 83, if I well remember. Immanuel asks me, what is your main interest? What is your concern? And of course, implicitly that meant on the side of theory, but also on the side of politics. And that was immediately after the neo-fascist French political party that grew even bigger later, the Front National, had won its first important local elections, which was a very striking, and to most of us, I mean, in our circles, very worrying phenomenon. Of course, they were already having the same political themes, insisting on the question of Islam was not yet central, but the question, of course, of migrations, so-called invasions from the former colonized people, what is now called, I find this absolutely disgusting, reverse colonization, you know. So this was very central. It was very racist already at the time. But not in the traditional language. So migrants in France, migrants, was a very insisting theme. So I said to Immanuel, what bothers me is racism. And it bothers me because it's politically worrying and meaningful, but also because I feel somehow theoretically disarmed or unable to address this question in an efficient manner. So I said, this is what bothers me. And then I returned the question, and I said to Immanuel, what is it that you find interesting, or would you like to work in this moment? And I remember you said ethnicity. I mean, you said, which of course had a slightly different background, not only American, but so we found that in a sense we had the same interests at the same time, and that couldn't be by chance, of course.
But there's one more thing to say about class. You have to remember that it was a period right after the Second World War, from 45 on, where
I was very young.
Everyone was a Marxist. I mean, more or less. And especially in France.
Everyone on the left.
Everyone on the left, yes. And then, how shall I say, there was a relatively sudden shift in which people said, oh no, that's, that's old stuff. And they removed the concept of class from the discussion. So putting it in this book is, in a sense, attempting to restore the discussion of class, which had in fact disappeared, and as I say, especially in France, but not only in France, France, Italy, even Germany.
If I can go back to the situation in the U.S., because Immanuel, Étienne, explained how he saw the importance of discussing the issues of racism in this particular situation in the 80s, and he said you were interested in ethnicity. So I would be really interested to hear more from you. How was that in this situation? I mean, it's like breathing into Marxism, these very difficult categories that have been ignored for a long time from Marxism, in order to renew Marxism, but at the same time, these are very unstable, contradictory analysis, and this, I think, is the strength of the book until today. That exactly this is what they provide, so that they show the limit of the other categories, but at the same time they are their external factor.
Well, in a sense, we were trying to reopen the discussion of all three categories from, how shall I say, agreed upon analyses which we came to think of as rather simplistic, so they were open for an attempt to reutilize them and create a discussion which is more useful theoretically and more useful politically. That discussion is still going on today.
Absolutely.
In fact, it's going on more strongly than when we published the book.
My sense in some ways is, and this is why, I have this passion for your book, and it was so helpful in my own biography.
We see that. We are incredibly grateful.
In some ways, I think this book is less simplistic than a lot of discussion that we have today. And it's particularly because it addresses the question from an interdisciplinary and in the 80s international, almost global scale. And it has this integral and at the same time discrete analysis of these categories. And the integral bit is a tricky bit, and it's something that I would like to have you talk more about.
When I agreed to participate in this discussion, I began to think about what was the point of the book. And I think the big message of the book is that race and nation and class are categories which should not be analyzed separately. That's the first thing. And should not, and are, how shall I say, three different pairs of glasses looking at the same phenomenon. If you do it from the angle of one or the other, it misses out. So the whole issue is what what is the relationship of race to nation to class? And the answer is it's a kind of 80% overlap. If you self-identify or analytically identify others and use racist terminology, I shouldn't call it racism terminology or class terminology, you get the same picture, but not quite. Okay, and it makes a good deal of difference to your theoretical analysis and to your political analysis which pair of glasses you want to use. And the answer is, at different times I want to use different pairs of glasses. I mean, that's my answer. If I say the working class, which was an old Marxist category, right? That was supposedly proletarians. It turns out that the people who are the proletarians, by traditional definition, are not the whites from the dominant class, but the blacks or people of color who are suppressed, etc., etc., etc. And so what's missing when one deals with them separately is not to see that 80% of the people who are proletarians are in fact of an undergroup according to class, or according to race or according to nation.
But at the same time, it's not smooth, because race and nation is something that you have a problematic and is different to the issues of class relations that you discuss.
We're starting a new seminar, and that's problematic because we don't have time for that.
Maybe
but,
you should.
It's tempting. So what he says about the overlapping of the categories and the necessity of overcoming a rigid and mechanistic understanding of either race, class, or nation, and study their interactions. This is more or less what people today would call intersection. We already discussed that in a manner that I find funny retrospectively when we discussed the title, or rather the subtitle of the book. The first edition is the French edition. And Immanuel had proposed, correct me if I'm wrong, a subtitle which was Les identités ambivalentes. He had proposed ambivalent identities. And I said, look, I don't like ambivalent so much. It's not exactly what I have in mind. I propose ambiguous identity. And I think that, in fact, the two adjectives both mean something. They're not unrelated, but so if you insist on the idea that identities are ambivalent, so you think of class identity, of national identity, of race identity, what you essentially suggest to the reader is the effects can go in very different directions. Nationalism, of course, is the nation or nationalism is, I think we basically agreed, even if we proposed it in slightly different terms, on the idea that nationalism is not a stigma. Nationalism is the organic ideology of whichever political and social movement or institution that creates or defends a nation. If you looked at anti-imperialist liberation struggles, which for both of us were absolutely central elements in our intellectual and political consciousness, because Immanuel had been directly involved in Africa and other places in what would become, I'd say, the third world emancipation struggles, and I had been awakened, so to speak, to political consciousness because I was a student at the time of the War of Independence of Algeria. So there is here an example of nationalism that not only is progressive, but without which you have no liberation, no emancipation. It's essentially, from a left point of view, a necessary and a positive factor. But of course, at the other end, you have what in English they have a whole terminology, jingoism. I mean, you have all sorts of xenophobic forms of nationalism. And of course, in the imperial nations like France or the US or others, this is the most visible aspect, which goes in the absolutely opposite direction. So can you say the same about race? To some extent. Can you say the same about class? Perhaps. Immanuel just gave the example of certain forms of class consciousness in the center, so to speak, which include, in fact, racist and sexist, I come to that, dimensions. So there's no example of one of these identities which are rooted on one side in objective structures of capitalism, of the world system, of imperialism and so on, of Eurocentrism, but which on the other side are identities or create identities that is have a subjective dimension. There's none of them which is not ambivalent. But on the other hand, ambiguous is also, in my view at least, and we agreed on that in the end, a necessary category because of intersection. Because if you look at concrete collective identities, even more if you take into account movements, forces that become active in politics and in society, they're never purely class identities or national identities or race or ethnic. So you never have something that is pure. You always have something that is ambiguous in that sense. And now to just add one thing, if you want to. So if you look at things from that point of view, and it's on purpose that I use the term intersection, there are several things that are clearly dramatically missing, or that seem to be missing, at least missing in the title. And the blatant, the most visible of all lacks and lacunae, not by chance, is gender. Is gender. So, but as soon as because that's another equally decisive identity, which has objective foundations in perhaps even older than capitalism, in patriarchy and so on, and of course decisive subjective dimensions and consequences. So as soon as I said that, I must qualify, because in fact, if you look at the book, the only one from among us who does take it into account is Immanuel, and not me. Immanuel explicitly says in the book that there are two great, I would say, anthropological structures, if you like, which are, is it their intention? It's not a question of intention, it's their function, that help producing hierarchies and stratifications among the workforce or the labor force in the capitalist world system, and these are race and gender. And he, I haven't reread the book, but he draws a very powerful parallel or analogy between the two.
And that's the introduction of the term household structure, which I think is very helpful in this respect, and something that sometimes in this current discussion that we have on issues where, you know, it's about intersections gets lost. And this is particularly the combination that you have just outlined of the household structure, the reproduction of the family within the genealogical scheme, but not only this, but also in terms of inheritance and property.
We were not using exactly the same conceptual framework.
But this is something that definitely, I think, so I'm far from saying, it shouldn't be in the book, but I think it's more in the book that one would think when you read the title
Yes,
of
but the
it.
fact remains that we didn't dare.
Yeah. Since we've talked about, the integral analysis a little bit, can we go to the discrete definitions or determinations of those terms? Going back to the question of racism, I would be very interested, if you look historically at it, and today maybe, what would be the most, are we in a situation in which the idea of racism has changed, even in comparison to the 1980s? And then, if so, how?
Well, look, we have rhetoric confusion.
Yeah.
Just today, I read in the New York Times or on the web or somewhere that that our dear president in the United States, President Trump, has, in trying to defend himself against various things, said, "I am not a racist." So he seems to think that to call someone a racist is how shall I say, an insult, and he denies that he is. It's a kind of deference to anti-racism. On the one hand, you could say, well, that's really very good because he has to say I'm not a racist. Okay, he wouldn't have felt that way 50 years ago. Okay. On the other hand, well, that's nonsense. He is obviously of the most virulent variety and the most shameless variety, but nonetheless he has to defer. So, from a long-term point of view, you could say, well, then anti-racism has achieved something if they force people like him to deny that they are racist.
Race is a very plastic and fluid, if you like, category. If you look at things from a historical point of view, in which you need to include, of course, institutions, representation, semantics, pseudo-scientific discourses, and so on, you see that race is not a category whose meaning can be fixed for very long. Of course, from Immanuel's point of view, I think the starting point and the anchor, so to speak, has to do with the fact that the capitalist world system, as it was built on colonization and then later post-colonization, includes very strong hierarchies and categorizations of populations on, I would say, essentially the basis of their origin, their ethnic origin, which includes all sorts of visible and invisible characters. But that doesn't mean that the category race always means the same. And if you go back to earlier periods when these stratifications emerge in the Spanish colonies and so on, even the word race doesn't mean exactly the same. It's applied, for example, to the aristocratic races and popular. And if you continue until now, of course, you see the progressive emergence of something that some scholars, and I more or less contributed to that, would call a racism without races in quotation marks, which means that the discriminations are no longer based on exactly the same criteria. But the discriminations are there. And I don't know if you'd agree with that, but I think that in the global world where we are now, where many social structures are transformed, race is not going to to disappear because there is such a mixture of population. It will perhaps become intensified especially to create antagonisms between different types of workforce. I mean,
the very concept of race is linked inevitably with the reality of hierarchy. If you have a hierarchy, so some people over here are considered more privileged, then you want to know why. Okay? And you've got to come up with some explanation of what justifies the hierarchy. And the minute you do that, you're being a racist. You use different terminology to do that, but that's why it doesn't disappear. As long as you're in a hierarchical system, you've got to be in a racist system. You've got to, because racism is simply the justification of the legitimacy of some people living better than other people in multiple different ways.
Yeah, I agree. But
that works.
Critical theory, Adorno, Horkheimer, they spend a great deal thinking about how do we explain anti-Semitism. And
well, that's what I wanted to come to, because from what Immanuel said, you can, based on what he said, and I'm absolutely not suggesting that Immanuel ignores anti-Semitism, but what he said just applies more or less directly to, I would say, two of the classical forms of racism included in the UNESCO declaration. That is colonial discriminations of subjected races, in quotes, and of course apartheid, the color bar, the legacy of slavery in the US, but it doesn't apply very simply to the case of anti-Semitism. I mean, in the case of anti-Semitism, you almost have the opposite. I mean, it's not the case that Jews are to be kept in an inferior racial position. It's the case that they are seen as internal enemies, as people who are better than the others in becoming capitalists, professor, and so on. So they are seen more, psychologically speaking, more as a threat
but
at the same level.
That's not terribly different from...
To me, it's very different.
You know, it's not terribly different from Trump appealing to, I mean, that's the situation of people who are in reality an underclass and who are resentful of this and decide to denominate those who are oppressing them by some category such as intellectuals, or well, it doesn't matter. So you've got the use of the concept of race there as a method of the undergroup deciding to push their way up a hierarchy by invoking this. Now that seems to me is what we're talking about with anti-Semitism classically. You have the idea of the Merchant of Venice, right? So these clever people who are really suppressing you money will turn against them, and that becomes anti-Semitism.
Yes, I agree, but that's not like despising ex-slaves or keeping the colonial peoples or races in a state of subjection. It's more like, of course I put all sorts of brackets and quotation marks, like suppressing or even eliminating an enemy or a competitor. Immanuel would, it seems to me, insist more directly on the the economic function and therefore the articulation to class. And I would insist more on the articulation with nation, and therefore the link that there is between racism, xenophobia, a certain understanding of the national identity as a homogeneous, has to do with the fact that that you need to take into account the cultural factor in the definition of race, and you need to take, even if you don't make Nazi Germany the paradigm after which everything has to be understood, which was a tendency, understandably, of course, in post-World War discourses, Horkheimer and Adorno and others, you have to take into account that certain forms of racism lead to extermination or elimination, if you like, more generally, and other forms lead to keeping the structures of exploitation and the hierarchies and the forms of exploitation as stable and as immutable as possible.
The rise of a new right and authoritarian regimes across the globe pairs up with very different right-wing religious movements. So how do you understand the current situation in light of this development, that everyone feels that, you know, retreating back to nationalism, retreating back to a very strong religious feeling that is, you know, that it is very strong in its right-wing rhetoric. How is this going to unfold?
I mean, if we're discussing Trump, it seems to me it's quite clear. He has actually been able to use a relatively large amount of resentment of people within the United States who have been losing ground in terms of the reality of their position in the world, and who are angry about that. And he comes along and he says, okay, then I'll be your champion. He imposed his personal role on a real situation, and he was quite competent in doing that, politically competent in doing that. And now he's running into trouble. He is claiming both strength of the United States and weakness of the United States at the same time. That contradiction in his rhetoric is going to turn people against him who have been for him.
And I remember that at the end of our book I included a tentative reflection on something called class racism, which I more or less borrowed from Bourdieu. So in the case of Trump's victory or success, a cultural element which has to do with a strong hostility between certain parts of the American working classes on one side, in the broad sense, and the neoliberal elites on the other side, has played an important role. I mean, Hillary's mistake, I mean, her Freudian slip when the microphone was not shut, and she spoke about the deplorables that are supporting the Republican candidate, that expressed a form of class racism, which of course makes no difference between Democrats and Republicans. And Trump managed, although he's a millionaire himself, he's absolutely not a representative of this elite culture. He shits on it, and that has been part of his appeal.
Part of his rhetoric is screamingly underclass against the capitalists.
At least he managed to present himself as an outsider within his own class.
That's right.
No.
I agree with that.
But the other question that, returning to the previous point, that bothers me, and I have no answer to that, is when we insist, when we observe, as you did, that religion is now more visible and perhaps even objectively playing a greater role in political changes and conflicts, and everywhere. Very often the religious discourse is used in a nationalist way to exclude, to purify the collective, body, to exclude foreigners who are becoming scapegoat, targeted as religious Christians in Pakistan, Muslims in Europe, and so on and so on. This is the occasion to say it.
Yeah.
I tend to believe that today Islamophobia, which in our countries, in Europe, and it's now also growing in the US. It perhaps always was there, but it was not a central issue, whereas now, because of September 11 and other things, and the ideological needs of Trump and his likes, this is also but in Europe, of course, it's absolutely central for 2 or 3 decades now, because of course of the growing population of migrants from Turkey, North Africa, Africa, and so on, plus other cultural factors. Islamophobia is a central issue for anti-racism. It's very difficult here in France. France is a terrible country for that, because our secular form of state secularism, plus the absolute denial and refusal to critically reflect on our colonization in the past in North Africa, leads to a virulent Islamophobia, which is proud of itself and which absolutely denies that it has racist characters. So that's the logic of nationalism. But I am not sure that religion is just today a cover name or a new for nationalism. It's a big, big question to me.
Do you think there is an option to go beyond racism?
The capitalist system is in structural crisis, and it will come out of it either as a new hierarchical, etc. system which will be ultra-racist, or something that's never existed historically ever, a relatively egalitarian system. So yes, it's possible. It's possible that we will go beyond racism, but it's unpredictable. We will ask me the question 40 years from now. Okay? 40 years from now, we will either have or not, because we will be in this bifurcation, which I see us in, will go into something much worse or much better.
Okay, good. Étienne?
I sometimes made fun, that was not very nice on my side, of Immanuel's prediction that the future will be either worse or better, which I said is not very different from a tautology or etc. But in fact, I like very much his idea of bifurcation, except I tend to believe that the bifurcation is not in the future, but the bifurcation is now.
That's right.
The future is not predictable, but the future is not inevitable. And if we believe that the kind of post-capitalism, if you like, the worst case, more unequal and oppressive system that could succeed the forms of capitalism, of historical capitalism, will have race discriminations and hatreds and violences as a central feature. This becomes all the more urgent. Imagine the other possibility, because I'm a philosopher perhaps, but I remain convinced that, I mean, that's Lévi-Strauss more or less. Lévi-Strauss' idea was, and it could lead to kind of euphemistic, his idea was human diversity is always a problem for humans. So human diversity means we are not all the same. And of course, these differences are not fixed. They are ethnic, they are linguistic, they are perhaps religious in the broad sense. There are differences of sexualities. There are also there, and that will never disappear. I mean, the fact that it is a problem, how to handle diversity. So it is not inevitable that human diversity becomes instrumentalized to build hierarchies and form racist oppressions. But there was a huge underestimation of the fact that this will remain a problem.
If you're saying diversity is inevitable, meaning every individual
No, but it's
who's ever
inevitable.
lived is different from every other individual who's ever lived in some way.
Yes, you're
In
right.
s-
But that's the mild way of
This is
saying it.
obviously true.
Yeah, but the question is whether it's bound to remain somehow conflictual.
Yes, and that's what I'm saying. That is not inevitable, that it remains forever in the future, that we categorize people in one of 10 different ways, give it names, say you belong in that group and you
Absolutely,
belong in that group,
absolutely.
and then we have, what is the
Absolutely,
relationship of the
absolutely.
groups? One's higher, one's
Absolutely.
lower, and you've got racism. I think unless you want a long discourse now, I better stop there. But I think that the answer to your question, will we ever go beyond racism, is maybe. Okay.
Thank you very much.